Around 2:45 on the afternoon of June 5th, 1986, a man in a gray Mercedes made a phone call from his car telephone. He was calling his family. He told them where he was going. He had a meeting at a drywall company office in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, and he expected it to be brief. His name was Robert DiBernardo. He was 49 years old, and he had spent most of those years building the largest criminal pornography empire in the United States, running it with more commercial intelligence than most legitimate distributors in the country could have matched. He paid financial tribute directly to the boss of the Gambino crime family, bypassing the chain of command that governed every other man of comparable standing in the organization. He helped plan the most audacious mob murder of the 20th century. He was the man who carried the first message, the one that set John Gotti's rise in motion, the man whose early and enthusiastic support for the conspiracy against Paul Castellano made the whole thing organizationally possible. 6 months after Castellano died on a midtown Manhattan sidewalk, DiBernardo was killed in a basement office by a man who got up to get him a cup of coffee and came back with a gun instead. The story of how the man who helped make John Gotti was erased by John Gotti, and what that erasure reveals about how power actually works inside a criminal organization at the moment of its peak, is one of the most precisely documented and most consistently overlooked stories in the history of American organized crime. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is honestly one of the best parts of doing this, hearing from people all around the world who find their way to these stories. If this is your first time here, and you want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Robert DiBernardo and the meeting he drove to on June 5th. By the spring of 1986, Robert DiBernardo was living at 1101 Harbor Road in Hewlett Harbor on the south shore of Long Island in a house that communicated nothing whatsoever about what he actually did for a living. The neighbors knew him as a quiet family man. He commuted each morning to an office at 418 Broome Street in Lower Manhattan, where he ran a distribution company. He dressed by multiple accounts like someone whose professional concerns were inventory and supply chains and quarterly margins, someone you would not look at twice on a midtown street or across a restaurant table. He drove a gray Mercedes. He did not discuss his work with people who were not already inside his world, and he had arranged his life so that those two populations, the people who knew and the people who did not, remained cleanly and permanently separated from each other. What he was actually doing, what the FBI had been documenting since 1968, and what two separate federal grand juries had tried and failed to make permanently stick in court, was controlling the distribution of pornography across the United States on a scale that no other single individual in the country came close to matching. His company, Star Distributors, operating out of Lower Manhattan, was the primary supplier of adult materials to businesses across New York City and one of the most significant distribution operations in the national market. He had reached from coast to coast. He had a working relationship with the largest pornography retailer in America. He had the organizational protection of the Gambino crime family standing behind every transaction and every conversation, protection that functioned not because it was ever explicitly stated, but because everyone operating in that industry already understood what it meant and what it cost to ignore it. His position inside the Gambino family was as structurally unusual as anything else about him. He paid financial tribute directly to the boss, Paul Castellano, bypassing the captain structure that governed every other made man of comparable standing in the organization. He commanded no crew. He had no soldiers beneath him whose personal loyalty would complicate any decision made about him at the top of the hierarchy. He walked into every organizational gathering alone, without the associates who normally communicated a man's weight inside the family. His weight came from money, and money, in the structure he operated within, was accepted as a substitute for soldiers as long as the man generating it remained essential to the people above him. In the first months of 1986, a federal investigation was closing around him from a direction he had not fully anticipated. Postal inspectors probing adult bookstores in Times Square and Greenwich Village had uncovered material depicting underage boys in sexually explicit circumstances. The materials had been traced back to his distribution network. In March of that year, investigators raided his Broome Street office and removed both the physical evidence and his financial records. An FBI memorandum dated May 20th, 1986, confirmed that a federal prosecutor was moving toward a formal indictment on child pornography charges. He had survived one enormous federal pornography prosecution already, involving 44 other defendants and simultaneous arrests in 16 cities, and had walked away from his conviction because of a legal collapse so extraordinary that appellate courts spent years untangling the questions it created. He had survived the moment in 1984 when his name appeared in presidential campaign coverage and introduced him to a national readership that had never encountered it. He had survived the transition from Paul Castellano to John Gotti and had navigated that transition better than almost anyone in the organization because he had placed himself on the correct side of it from the very beginning. What was moving toward him from a federal direction in the spring of 1986 was more serious than anything the government had previously assembled against him, and it was moving quickly. He never appeared before any grand jury to answer for what the postal inspectors had found in his office. He never had the opportunity to test whether his lawyers could locate in the new case the same structural weakness that had undone the old one. The federal investigation that was finally going to reach him did not kill him. What killed him was a conversation he was never in the room to hear. He was born on May 31st, 1937, in Hewlett, a community on the south shore of Long Island situated in the kind of New York metropolitan suburb that in the post-war decades received Italian immigrant families moving outward from Brooklyn and Queens into the towns along the shore. The specific details of his early life are not elaborated in the sources that eventually documented his criminal career, and this absence is consistent with the kind of man he became. He preferred thin biographical records. He found ways to maintain that preference over decades of sustained federal surveillance. What can be established is that by his early to middle 20s, DiBernardo had identified the specific intersection of commercial opportunity and organized crime protection that would define the next 3 decades of his working life. His earliest formal organizational connection was to the De Cavalcante crime family, the New Jersey-based operation that maintained significant reach across the Hudson River while functioning with far less public visibility than the 5 families whose territories were concentrated in the New York boroughs. The De Cavalcante organization was smaller and less celebrated than its New York counterparts, but it was operationally active across a range of industries and maintained relationships with its larger neighbors that made membership a viable starting point for a young man with commercial ambitions in the greater metropolitan area. DiBernardo was identified in contemporaneous news reporting in the early 1970s as a soldier affiliated with the De Cavalcante organization, and testimony before the New York State Commission of Investigation in 1970 linked his activities to businesses the commission connected to organized crime interests. He was not, at that point, a figure anyone in law enforcement had identified as particularly significant. He was a young man operating in a market that the law was, in that moment, still actively working to define and regulate. Times Square in the late 1960s was unlike any other single district in the country, and it was unlike them in ways that were expanding rather than contracting. The Supreme Court's gradual liberalization of obscenity standards through a series of decisions in the 1950s and early 1960s had created legal uncertainty about exactly where the regulatory line was drawn, and in the absence of a clear line, the blocks concentrated around 42nd Street in Midtown Manhattan had moved in the direction that legal uncertainty reliably creates space for. Peep show parlors, adult bookstores, and theaters selling explicit films crowded the area with a density and an explicitness that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The police did not enforce obscenity laws in that territory with anything approaching consistency. The city's fiscal situation, which would reach its most acute stage in the mid-1970s but was already contracting municipal resources by the late 60s, was reducing the capacity of city agencies across virtually every function that was not immediately and visibly violent. What the law did not prohibit, commerce filled. DiBernardo looked at that district and saw something that most people walking past its storefronts did not. He saw a market with growing national demand, no effective competition that had organized itself under a single structure, and no law enforcement likely to change any of those conditions in the near term. He saw a supply chain that was fragmented enough to be consolidated by someone willing to provide what all the scattered operators needed: reliability, organizational backing, and the protection that made both of those things credible. He had been arrested by the New York Police Department in 1968 for distributing an obscene magazine, a publication that police records identified by the title Young Stuff. The arrest was the beginning of a monitoring relationship between federal law enforcement and Robert DiBernardo that would run for 18 uninterrupted years. It was not, however, a stop. The thing that separated what he became from every other man working those same margins was something he acquired in the late years of the 1960s, a business purchase whose exact price the available historical record does not preserve. Star Distributors had been a softcore pornography distribution business when DiBernardo acquired it, operating out of 150 Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan, occupying the legal gray zone that existed before the Supreme Court's 1973 Miller decision established a workable standard for what the government could prohibit. The company distributed materials explicit enough to be commercially valuable but sufficiently ambiguous to operate in the space between tolerated and banned. DiBernardo changed it entirely. He moved the inventory from softcore into hardcore content of every variety and format available in that market, and he built distribution relationships with adult businesses across New York's 5 boroughs before extending those relationships outward across the country. His formal business partner in the operation was Theodore Rothstein, who served as the company's nominal president. DiBernardo held the title of vice president. A man named Nathan Kramer occupied the secretary-treasurer position. These were the officers of record at 150 Lafayette Street, and on paper they ran a distribution company whose products occupied a legally contested space. What the paper did not show was the organizational infrastructure supporting every transaction. The mob connection to Star Distributors was not something DiBernardo articulated explicitly in any documented sales conversation. He did not need to. Men operating in the adult entertainment industry in New York in the 1970s understood what it meant to do business with a company backed by organized crime, and they understood what it meant to decline. Men who declined to do business with Star Distributors found that alternative arrangements were consistently more difficult to establish than they should have been, that the operational conditions of the market had a persistent way of favoring those who had made their accommodation with its actual structure. Men who understood and accommodated found things correspondingly easier. Al Goldstein, who published the adult magazine Screw for decades and relied on Star Distributors and its affiliated company Astro for national distribution, described the situation with the directness that characterized everything he said publicly about his business. He told the New York Times that he had no options regarding who he dealt with, because no legitimate distributor would handle his publication, and that as long as he continued generating income for the people behind Star Distributors, he felt his position was stable. This was not an endorsement. It was a description of how the economics of operating in a market under organized crime control actually functioned for everyone inside it. He built a national relationship with Reuben Sturman, who ran the largest pornography retail operation in the United States from a base in Cleveland, operating peep show machines and adult retail locations across the country. Whether DiBernardo's relationship with Sturman rested on extortion, on mutual commercial advantage, or on some shifting combination of both was never definitively established in the available record. What the record did establish, through FBI audio surveillance, was that DiBernardo told another significant industry figure, Michael Thevis, that the family was in charge of his businesses. The statement was a notification, not a negotiation. He commissioned adult films produced in New York during the period that industry historians describe as the commercial peak of explicit filmmaking before the industry relocated predominantly to Southern California. He co-opted rivals where co-option was possible and displaced them where it was not. He extended his operation into Philadelphia through interests held with associates there and maintained his South Florida reach through the connection Ettore Zappi's organization provided. He did not present himself as anything other than a businessman, and in the commercial sense that mattered most to him, that was accurate. He understood margins and supply relationships and the value of consistency across years of operation. The money he was making was real, and real money, in the organization he served, never stayed unnoticed for long. The man who brought him formally into the Gambino family was named Ettore Zappi, a capo based in South Florida who had been managing the Gambino organization's pornography interests in that market, and who recognized in DiBernardo a commercial capability the organization could extend and direct. Zappi sponsored DiBernardo for formal membership, and by the early to middle 1970s, the transfer from the De Cavalcante family was complete. He was no longer a New Jersey soldier operating at the margins of the New York family's territories. He was a made man in the most powerful criminal organization in New York City. The arrangement his membership produced was structurally unusual in a way that defined his position for the remainder of his life. Most men in the Gambino family occupied a standard chain of command. Soldier reported to a capo, capo reported to the administration, money and information moved upward through each layer. DiBernardo had no capo above him. He paid tribute directly to the boss, Paul Castellano. The intermediate layer was absent from his organizational reality. This arrangement reflected a specific calculation. DiBernardo's commercial output was too consistent and too significant to root through a middle layer that would reduce both the cash flow and the directness of the relationship. Castellano was a particular kind of boss. He managed the family with the disposition of a corporate executive who preferred to see the organization's activities embedded in industries that were, at least on their surface, respectable. He controlled the family's involvement in the construction industry, the waterfront, and the labor unions that governed both, and he cultivated the institutional distance from street-level criminal activity that he believed served the family's long-term interests. The pornography business that DiBernardo operated was, in Castellano's private assessment, beneath the kind of organization he was trying to run. He made this view known to people around him. He accepted a substantial percentage of DiBernardo's returns with complete consistency regardless. This was the central grievance that shaped everything DiBernardo understood about his position. He was generating significant income for a boss who found the source of that income to be a source of mild private embarrassment, who took the money without offering anything resembling recognition in return. DiBernardo had no formal rank that signaled his standing to the rest of the family. There was no crew beneath him, no soldiers whose presence in a room communicated anything about the resources behind the man they accompanied. He was a made man who had achieved that status through commercial achievement in a world built on the capacity for violence, and the absence of that history was a specific form of exposure. It mattered less when the men above him wanted to keep him alive. He was one of the most valuable men in the organization and one of the least protected, a combination that functioned without apparent difficulty as long as everyone above him continued to find the arrangement convenient. In the summer of 1977, the FBI launched what its leadership described at the time as the largest undercover investigation in the agency's history, directed at the obscenity industry. The operation received the internal designation My Porn, derived from its Miami base of operations. Two agents, Patrick Livingston and Bruce Olavsky, established cover identities as pornography distributors, running a company called Gold Coast out of Miami. The initial authorization was for a 6-month operation with a budget of $25,000. The investigation ran for 2.5 years and consumed nearly $500,000 as the two agents built working relationships with distributors, producers, and suppliers throughout the national adult entertainment network. On February 14, 1980, the field phase concluded simultaneously across the country. 400 FBI agents moved in 16 cities. 53 defendants were arrested in a single coordinated sweep. Among the major publishers and distributors of adult films and magazines in the United States, almost none of significance were left untouched. DiBernardo and Rothstein were among the 44 individuals eventually convicted in the proceedings that followed. Michael Zaffarano, a Bonanno family capo who served as the primary organized crime contact between the mob and the adult film production industry, suffered a fatal heart attack at the moment agents arrived at his location to arrest him. He had understood immediately what was happening. He was dead before they could formally place him under arrest. DiBernardo's conviction, handed down in 1981, appeared at the time to be the end of the operation he had spent 12 years building. Then came one of the most legally extraordinary collapses in the history of federal prosecution. In November of 1981, Patrick Livingston, the lead undercover agent whose work over 2.5 years had formed the evidentiary foundation of the My Porn case, was arrested for shoplifting. At the moment of his arrest, Livingston identified himself to the officers using the undercover identity documents he had accumulated during the investigation. Psychiatric examination found that Livingston had developed a serious and clinically documented inability to distinguish between his real identity and the identity he had inhabited as an undercover agent. He had lived inside the role too long. The boundary between Patrick Livingston, the federal agent, and the cover persona had become genuinely unclear to him. The implications for every prosecution built on his work were immediate and significant. Defense attorneys across the MI porn proceedings filed motions. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals addressed the resulting questions through multiple rounds of review across the following years. What emerged from those proceedings was the reversal of DiBernardo's conviction. He had been tried, convicted, and sentenced, and he walked away from it because the agent who built the case against him could no longer reliably determine which version of himself was real. The My Porn prosecution had been designed to dismantle the distribution infrastructure DiBernardo controlled. Its legal collapse left that infrastructure largely intact. His operation continued. His national relationships continued. The income continued. But a different investigative thread had been developing independently of the MI Porn proceedings. FBI documents from as early as July 28, 1981, described DiBernardo in precise terms as a well-known pornography distributor also dealing in child pornography. By the middle years of the decade, that surveillance notation had evolved into an active prosecutorial effort moving faster than the Broome Street office had reason to expect. The conviction the government spent years assembling had been reversed on grounds that no defense strategy could have designed in advance. What was developing now was a case no undercover agent was going to compromise from the inside. He had spent his entire career operating without public attention, which was precisely the way men in his position preferred to work, and then in the summer of 1984 his name appeared in newspapers across the country and remained there for weeks. Walter Mondale, the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, announced the selection of Representative Geraldine Ferraro of New York as his vice presidential running mate in July of 1984. Ferraro was the first woman nominated for national office by a major American political party. The announcement generated broadly positive attention, and early polling showed the Mondale-Ferraro ticket running stronger after the selection than it had before. The campaign had momentum in a way that the numbers were measuring. Then the financial scrutiny that accompanies any major candidacy arrived, and with it a connection that no political operation was equipped to manage cleanly in the middle of a presidential race. Ferraro's husband, John Zaccaro, was a New York real estate developer with multiple business interests and financial arrangements that required disclosure once his wife accepted the nomination. Among the properties managed by his company, P. Zaccaro, Inc., was a building in Lower Manhattan. Star Distributors had been renting its business premises from a building in Zaccaro's portfolio for years, operating out of a space in a building that the husband of the Democratic vice presidential nominee had a financial interest in. An intelligence report from the New York State Organized Crime Task Force noted that Zaccaro had been observed in conversation with DiBernardo, the tenant, the building, the landlord's family connection to the top of a presidential ticket. The configuration became a story that resisted resolution regardless of what the campaign said in response to it. Ferraro stated publicly that she and Zaccaro had been unaware of the nature of Star Distributors' business until the news coverage made it impossible to remain unaware. She promised to have the tenant removed from the property. Star Distributors remained in the building for 3 more years despite the promise. Meanwhile, the campaign found itself answering questions about organized crime associations that had nothing to do with Ferraro's own record and everything to do with one tenant in one of her husband's buildings, in a media environment where the association itself was sufficient to generate sustained coverage, regardless of what an investigation found. The couple paid $53,459 in back taxes to the Internal Revenue Service following a professional review of their returns that the nomination disclosure requirements had triggered. No impropriety involving DiBernardo was established against either Ferraro or Zaccaro. The formal absence of impropriety arrived too late, and with too little force to fully undo what the coverage had already created in the public record. Mondale and Ferraro lost to Ronald Reagan in November of 1984 in one of the most decisive electoral outcomes in modern presidential history, winning only Mondale's home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia. The damage extended past that campaign. When Ferraro ran for the Democratic Senate nomination from New York in 1992, she lost the primary by a narrow margin, and post-election analysis attributed part of that outcome to the association with DiBernardo's name that the 1984 coverage had created, and that subsequent reporting had periodically refreshed. A man who had operated in deliberate invisibility for nearly 2 decades had, through the accident of a rental arrangement he almost certainly never reflected on, attached his name to one of the historic political campaigns of the era, and to a chain of political consequences that ran for nearly a decade. He had not sought any of it, it had not served his interests, and it had introduced his name to a wider law enforcement audience that brought a different and more consequential lens to what they found when they looked closely. September 1985. The Gambino family was in a condition that could not remain stable, and the men who understood its internal structure well enough to read the signals were already calculating what position they needed to occupy when the instability resolved itself. Paul Castellano was facing a racketeering prosecution that most observers inside the organization expected would result in a prison sentence. His response to that legal pressure had been to draw the family's anticipated future structure closer to his nephew Thomas Gambino and to Thomas Bilotti, his driver and most trusted personal associate, signaling to those who paid attention that Bilotti was the man he intended to elevate to underboss. This was not a signal that was received warmly by the captains who had been developing their own standing within the hierarchy for years, and who regarded Bilotti's accumulation of influence as something that had not been earned through the organizational history that would have legitimized it in other circumstances. There was a second and more immediately dangerous problem. Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti's childhood friend and closest associate within the family, had been caught on FBI surveillance tapes discussing heroin operations with members of Gotti's crew. Castellano had established explicitly and repeatedly that narcotics dealing by Gambino family members would be punished by death. He had the tapes. He had listened to them. The question running through Gotti's circle in the fall of 1985 was not whether Castellano would move against them, but when. There were men in Gotti's immediate orbit who believed Castellano was already preparing to act. Into this situation, DiBernardo moved with the specific usefulness that had always defined his organizational value. He did not belong to any single faction in a way that would make a message from him automatically read as a provocation before it had been delivered. He was trusted across different parts of the organization simultaneously, a quality produced by years of operating as a commercial entity rather than as a territorial crew. He was the kind of man you sent when you needed something to begin, without the beginning itself becoming a dangerous escalation. In September of 1985, DiBernardo contacted Sammy Gravano and delivered a message. Gotti and Ruggiero wanted to meet with Gravano in Queens. When Gravano arrived, Ruggiero was the only one present. Ruggiero laid out what was being considered. He and Gotti were planning the murder of Paul Castellano, and they needed to know whether Gravano was with them or against them. Gravano did not commit immediately. He said he needed to speak with Frank De Chico before he could take any position. DeCicco had historically been Castellano's man, and knowing where DeCicco stood would tell Gravano what the actual balance of forces inside the organization looked like. DiBernardo was not at the Queen's meeting. He had made the phone call that put it together. In the structure of the organization, that function, being trusted enough by both parties to make the first contact and credible enough with the person being approached to have the call received as serious rather than as a trap, was not a minor thing. It required both parties to trust you with knowledge that could destroy everyone involved if it moved in the wrong direction. DiBernardo put himself in that position willingly. His grievances against Castellano were real and had been accumulating for years. The organization had taken his money consistently and returned little in the way of formal recognition. He was ready for the transition being planned, and he made himself part of making it happen. Agnello della Croce, the family's underboss, died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985. Castellano did not attend the wake. His stated explanation was that his legal situation made any public appearance at a gathering that would draw law enforcement attention inadvisable. The men who had been loyal to Della Croce understood the absence as something other than legal caution. Gotti, who had been among Della Croce's most committed followers, received the news of Castellano's absence as the final piece of a decision that had been forming in his thinking for months. The team assembled for December 16th wore trench coats and Russian-style fur hats and took their positions outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, where Castellano had a dinner meeting. Gotti and Gravano were in a car nearby, connected to the team by walkie-talkie. When Castellano's car arrived and he stepped onto the sidewalk, the order was given. Castellano was shot 6 times. Thomas Bilotti, who had been driving and stepped out alongside him, was shot 4 times. Both died on East 46th Street on a December evening while holiday pedestrians in Midtown Manhattan registered what they were hearing. The bodies outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16th, 1985, were the culmination of a process that had started 3 months earlier with a phone call DiBernardo placed to Gravano asking if he was available for a conversation in Queens. After Castellano was dead, the family reorganized itself around the man who had killed him with the speed that organizations capable of decisive internal violence apply to power transitions when everyone with relevant knowledge already understands what the new configuration will be. Gotti emerged as the acknowledged boss within days. He was 55 years old, a Howard Beach native who had been building organizational authority and federal attention in parallel for most of his adult life. His style as a public figure was the precise opposite of the institutional distance that Castellano had cultivated. Gotti held captain meetings at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, while FBI cameras documented arrivals and departures from across the street. He appeared at restaurants and social events that were well-known gathering points for organized crime figures, and made no visible effort to limit his exposure to the cameras that followed him. He dressed with expensive conspicuousness that made him recognizable to people who had never read a newspaper article about organized crime. He seemed to understand that his own celebrity was the point in a way that previous Gambino leadership would have found reckless, and that Castellano, who had cultivated the appearance of a corporate executive as a deliberate organizational strategy, would have found indefensible. The men who had supported the coup received their recognition. DiBernardo was elevated to the rank of caporegime. The promotion acknowledged that he had been on the correct side of the most consequential internal decision in the organization's recent history, and it gave him a formal standing in the hierarchy that he had not previously held. In structural terms, however, the promotion changed nothing that actually mattered in the world they inhabited. He still commanded no crew. He had no soldiers beneath him whose presence in a room communicated anything about the resources behind the man they followed. A captaincy in the Gambino family meant something specific and practical, and what it meant was the group of men who would make any move against you a complicated and potentially costly undertaking. DiBernardo had the title without the complication. Frank DeCicco was named underboss. He had originally been Castellano's man and had crossed to Gotti's side in the weeks before the murder, a pragmatic calculation that proved accurate and placed him at the second position in the new administration. He held it for less than 4 months. On April 13th, 1986, DeSico walked toward his parked car outside a social club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A bomb planted beneath the vehicle detonated when he approached it. DeCicco was killed. Gotti had been expected to be at the same location that day and had changed his plans. The bombing was attributed to commission-aligned forces responding to the principle that the murder of a sitting boss without commission authorization was a violation that required a formal response. The response did not reach Gotti. It reached the man who had been standing beside him. Joe Armoni took the underboss position. The organizational landscape settled into the configuration that would hold for the following years. The man now positioned most directly between Gotti and the rest of the family's daily operational life, the one trusted to carry instructions and relay decisions when Gotti was absent or constrained, was Angelo Ruggiero, who had grown up alongside Gotti in Howard Beach, shared his history across decades, and had accumulated a debt to Robert DiBernardo that the record would eventually establish at a considerable sum. Robert DiBernardo was navigating two distinct problems in the first months of 1986, but he had full visibility into only one of them. The federal investigation he was aware of was serious by any measure. Child pornography charges occupied a different legal and moral register than the obscenity charges the MI porn prosecution had brought. The legal framework around them was more settled and less susceptible to the kind of procedural collapse that had undone his earlier conviction. The investigative structure did not depend on the extended undercover work that had created the vulnerability, allowing his My Porn conviction to be reversed. He had capable attorneys who had navigated federal prosecution with him before, but the grounds for repeating that outcome were narrower than they had been in 1981, and he understood the difference. The other problem existed entirely outside his awareness. It was being constructed in the conversations that Angelo Ruggiero was conducting with Gotti from the inside of a jail cell, conversations to which DiBernardo had no access and about which he had received no warning. DiBernardo's structural position inside the Gotti administration created the specific conditions that made what happened to him possible. He commanded no crew. He appeared at every organizational gathering alone, without the associates whose presence around a captain signals the practical weight behind his title. There were no men whose personal obligation to DiBernardo would create any meaningful institutional resistance for anyone deciding to move against him. In an organization where captains' personal soldiers provided the friction that made moves against a captain complicated and potentially costly, DiBernardo was a captain with no such friction anywhere behind him. He also controlled income streams that other men in the organization could absorb if he were removed. His connection to Teamsters Local 282, which represented the workers who transported building materials to construction sites across New York City, gave whoever held it significant leverage over one of the most consistently profitable industries the organization had embedded itself in for decades. Sammy Gravano was developing his own construction business and was positioned to benefit from control of that union relationship in immediate practical terms. The connection was known to exist, known to be valuable, and known to be accessible to whoever stepped into DiBernardo's organizational place. He had survived everything the federal government had assembled against him across nearly 2 decades of monitoring and prosecution. He was not attending to the conversation that was building in the space between Gotti's jail cell and the rest of the world. In June of 1986, Angelo Ruggiero arrived at Sammy Gravano's door with an order he said came from John Gotti. Gotti was incarcerated at the time, awaiting trial on a racketeering indictment the government had been building against him since 1985. Ruggiero was the only Gambino family member allowed access to Gotti during his incarceration, the exclusive channel through which Gotti's instructions moved outward into the organization and through which the family's internal news reached the boss. This position of exclusive access meant that Ruggiero controlled, to a significant extent, what Gotti understood about the family's internal dynamics during this period. What the boss knew was, in practical terms, what Ruggiero chose to communicate, framed in the way Ruggiero chose to frame it. Ruggiero told Gravano that DiBernardo had been acting subversive. He specified the accusation. DiBernardo had been making statements behind Gotti's back that undermined the boss's standing within the family. He had told people that Gravano would make a better underboss than the current arrangement provided for. He had discussed with Gravano the possibility of organizing specific actions without first seeking Gotti's authorization, a violation of the chain of command that no boss in that world could acknowledge without demonstrating to everyone watching that his authority was conditional. Gravano's response to this account is documented in his trial testimony and in the memoir he published after cooperating with the federal government, and it amounts to the most precisely articulated expression of skepticism about a mob murder order in the public record of that era. He could not understand how DiBernardo could constitute a threat to anyone. DiBernardo had no crew. He was not associated with violence in any documented way. He had no soldiers whose personal loyalty and capacity for action made any power play conceivable. The portrait Ruggiero was drawing required as its essential foundation the one thing DiBernardo most conspicuously lacked. Gravano's own words, preserved in testimony, were direct and specific. DiBernardo had no crew, he was not a shooter, he was no threat. Gravano tried to introduce delay. He told Ruggiero the matter could wait until Gotti was released, that when Gotti was out they could all sit together and address whatever the concern was directly, in person. The answer that came back through Ruggiero was that Gotti was growing angry the order had not already been carried out. The delay had itself become a problem. What Gravano did not know at this moment, and what he would not discover until after the killing was already done, was that Ruggiero owed DiBernardo approximately $250,000. When Gravano learned the figure afterward, he arrived at a conclusion about what had actually happened. Ruggiero had constructed the account of DiBernardo's subversive behavior, or had shaped it in ways designed to reach Gotti with maximum force in order to eliminate a creditor whose claim against him disappeared permanently the moment the creditor himself did. The man who had pushed hardest for DiBernardo's death, who had carried the accusation to Gotti, and then carried the order to Gravano, was the man who stood to benefit most financially from the outcome. The FBI recording made at the Ravenite Social Club in December of 1989 captures what Gotti said when he discussed this with Frank Locascio. He was in jail when DIB was killed, he said. They told him a story. He knew why it was being done. He'd done it anyway. He allowed it to be done anyway. The statement carries a specific implication. Gotti understood that the story he was told might not be accurate and gave the order regardless. Whether this reflected a separate calculation about DiBernardo's growing federal exposure, genuine belief in Ruggiero's account despite its evident structural problems, or simply an exercise of authority for its own sake, the record does not establish with certainty. Gravano said yes, not because he believed DiBernardo was capable of threatening anyone, because the man delivering the order was the boss's oldest friend, and in the hierarchy they all operated within, that was sufficient. June 5th, 1986 began as an ordinary afternoon. DiBernardo had been at his Broome Street office through the morning and into the early hours of the afternoon, occupied with the work of running a distribution business that was, by the standards of the previous decade, continuing to function. Theodore Rothstein, who had shared the Star Distributors operation with DiBernardo for close to 2 decades and who had stood beside him through the My Porn prosecution and all the legal proceedings that followed it, was present at the office that day. He was the last person to see DiBernardo at 418 Broome Street. Whatever passed between them in the final conversation they had, the record does not preserve it. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, DiBernardo left the office. He walked to where the gray Mercedes was parked and got in. Around 2:45, he reached for the car telephone and called his family. He told them where he was going, a meeting in Bensonhurst at a drywall company office. Brief and unremarkable, he would be home. The address was 1809 Stillwell Avenue in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. The premises were connected to a construction business in Gravano's orbit, one of the companies through which Gravano's construction operation conducted its day-to-day work. DiBernardo had met with Gravano multiple times across their shared business interests in the construction industry, and whatever specific pretext had been used to arrange this meeting had been accepted without apparent concern. One account of the period notes that DiBernardo had initially indicated his schedule was full when the meeting was first proposed and had agreed to come once a time opened up. He fitted in as something manageable between other obligations. He arrived at Stillwell Avenue. He walked into the building and into the office. He sat down. The meeting began as what it appeared to be a brief discussion of a business matter connected to the construction interests they shared. At some point in the meeting, Gravano told Joseph Peruta to get DiBernardo a cup of coffee. Peruta had been working with Gravano's operation for years. He was described in subsequent accounts of the Gravano organization as the man Gravano trusted for tasks that required total reliability and no hesitation. He was not a man whose usefulness was measured by his ability to retrieve beverages. Peruta stood from his seat. He did not move towards wherever the coffee was kept. He moved to a cabinet positioned behind where DiBernardo was sitting. From that cabinet he took a .38 caliber revolver. He shot Robert DiBernardo in the back of the head. The body was removed from the Stillwell Avenue office and disposed of through means the available record does not establish. Robert DiBernardo's body was never found. The organization absorbed what he had controlled with the efficiency that closed systems apply to the redistribution of assets once a vacancy has been created. Sammy Gravano took over the family's connection to Teamsters Local 282, the union representing workers who transported building materials to construction sites across New York City. Control of that connection meant leverage over one of the most consistently profitable industries the organization had embedded itself in across decades. Gravano's own description of what the acquisition meant was unambiguous. He had control of the whole thing. Joseph Peruta continued working for Gravano until lung cancer ended his capacity to do so. As Peruta was dying, Gravano arranged for him to be inducted into the Gambino family as a formally made member, the ceremony that had always required a candidate to have committed murder. The murder existed. Peruta received the recognition before he died. DiBernardo's daughter, Lori DiBernardo Coonan, eventually went to a court to have her father declared legally dead. There was no body and no official communication of any kind from the organization that had employed him and then decided he was finished. She testified at John Gotti's murder and racketeering trial in Brooklyn in 1992, called to the stand by the prosecution to establish for the record the legal process she had gone through to have her father's death formally acknowledged. Her voice, as described in contemporaneous trial reporting, was audible in the courtroom in a way that the surrounding proceedings were not. 3.5 years after the afternoon in Bensonhurst on December 12, 1989, FBI listening devices installed in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy recorded a conversation between John Gotti and his consigliere, Frank Locascio. The conversation turned at some point to Robert DiBernardo. Gotti said he had been in jail when DiB was killed. They had told him a story. He had known why it was being done. He had done it anyway. He had allowed it to be done anyway. Robert DiBernardo's body was never recovered. 3.5 years after the office on Stillwell Avenue, the man who gave the order said out loud what he had done, and the FBI was listening to every word. What DiBernardo's story reveals about John Gotti is not what the newspaper coverage concentrated on when the trial played out in Brooklyn in 1992. The coverage was focused on the reversal of the Teflon Don's remarkable record of acquittals, on Gravano's testimony, and what it meant that the man closest to Gotti had decided to cooperate with the government, on the spectacle of the most famous organized crime figure in the country being finally and permanently placed behind bars. DiBernardo appeared in the indictment as one murder count among 5 in a verdict covering racketeering across decades, but the count is worth following because of what it demonstrates about the mechanism. Gotti killed the man who helped make him. He did so on the word of a man who owed that man $250,000, delivered through a channel that could not be independently verified while Gotti sat inside a jail cell, and he gave the order while acknowledging, in his own subsequently captured words, that the story he was told might not be fully accurate. He eliminated a man who had no crew, no soldiers, and no capacity for the power play he was accused of planning. The income streams that man controlled moved directly to Sammy Gravano. Gravano used the Teamsters connection to build his own construction power, accumulated independent leverage within the organization, and then, when he heard himself described on an FBI recording as someone Gotti was positioning to absorb the blame for multiple murders, made the decision to cooperate with the government that had been pursuing the organization for years. That cooperation produced Gotti's conviction in April of 1992. The phone call at 2:45 on June 5th was the last call Robert DiBernardo made. He told his family where he was going, and then he drove across Brooklyn to an address on Stillwell Avenue and walked inside and sat down. He had survived nearly 2 decades of federal attention. He had survived the most comprehensive undercover obscenity prosecution the FBI had ever mounted, and had walked away from his conviction because of what happened to the internal sense of identity of a single undercover agent over 2.5 years of living a false life. He had survived the moment when a presidential campaign accidentally illuminated his name to every newspaper reader in the country. He had survived the transition from Castellano to Gotti and placed himself on the right side of it. He had carried the message in September of 1985 that no one else in the organization was positioned to carry, and the man who received that message had used it to become the most powerful organized crime figure in New York City. He did not survive the debt that the man who relayed the order was carrying. John Gotti was convicted in April of 1992 on 5 murder counts, including DiBernardo's, sentenced to life in prison without parole, and died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10th, 2002. Angelo Ruggiero died of cancer in December of 1989. The same month, the FBI recorded Gotti's admission at the Ravenite, before the full weight of what he had arranged in June of 1986 had arrived at the doors it was headed for. DiBernardo had been exactly the kind of man the organization needed, and exactly the kind of man the organization consumed. He could move between worlds, carry dangerous messages, build commercial empires, and generate income without requiring the infrastructure of violence that surrounded everyone around him. The qualities that made him useful as an instrument were the same qualities that left him unguarded when the instrument became inconvenient. Being the man who could carry any message also meant being the man who could be eliminated without the organizational friction that protected everyone else. He drove to Bensonhurst. He sat down. He waited for a cup of coffee that was never coming.